It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning that makes you forget the world can be ugly. The sky over Weimar was clear, the air was crisp, and the trees lining the road out of the city were just beginning to bloom. Spring in Germany, 1945. And if you stood on that road and watched the column of people marching out of the city, you might have thought they were heading to a festival. The women were dressed in fur coats, their lips painted red, their heels clicking against the cobblestones. The men wore tailored suits and fedora hats, their leather shoes freshly polished. They were chatting with each other, some laughing, some fixing their hair. A few of them even smiled at the American soldiers flanking them on both sides, but those soldiers weren't smiling back. They were dirty. Hollow-eyed men with their fingers resting on the triggers of their M1 Garand, their jaws tight, their faces carved from stone. They weren't escorting these people to a festival. They were marching them at gunpoint up a hill called the Ettersberg, 5 miles outside the city, toward a place that the civilians insisted they had never heard of, a place called Buchenwald. And by the time those 1,000 well-dressed, well-educated, self-proclaimed innocent citizens of Weimar reached the top of that hill, not one of them would be smiling anymore. This is the story of the day General George S. Patton decided to destroy the greatest lie in Germany, the lie of the good citizen who knew nothing. To understand what happened on that hill, you first have to understand what Weimar meant to Germany, because Weimar wasn't just a city, it was an idea. It was the living proof that Germany was the most culturally advanced nation in Europe, maybe in the world. Goethe had walked these streets. Schiller had written some of the greatest poetry in the German language here. The Bauhaus movement, the artistic revolution that changed the way the entire world thought about design and architecture, was born in Weimar. The city had theaters, libraries, grand concert halls. Its citizens were professors and lawyers and doctors and businessmen. They read Kant over breakfast. They debated philosophy in the evenings. They went to the opera on weekends. They were proud people, deeply, profoundly, almost arrogantly proud of what their city represented. And 5 miles up a tree-lined scenic road, in the shadow of the same hills where Goethe used to take his evening walks, there was a factory of death. A Buchenwald concentration camp was established in 1937. Not in some remote wilderness, not hidden behind mountains or buried in a forest 100 miles from civilization. It was built right there, practically in the backyard of the most cultured city in Germany. For 8 straight years it operated. 8 years of smoke rising from the crematorium chimneys. 8 years of ash drifting down over the city like grey snow, settling on window ledges and garden furniture, and the freshly laundered clothes hanging on the lines outside the grand villas. The SS officers who ran the camp didn't live inside its walls. They lived in Weimar. They had nice suburban houses. Their wives did their shopping in the same boutiques as the professors' wives. They sat in the same restaurants, attended the same concerts, shook hands with the same city council members at the same civic events. The smell alone should have told the story. When the wind blew in the right direction, the stench of death rolled down that hill and into the streets of the city. Former prisoners would later testify that on certain days you couldn't escape it anywhere in Weimar. It sat in the air like a fog, heavy, greasy, impossible to ignore. And yet the citizens of Weimar had a remarkable, almost supernatural ability to explain it away. It was a factory, they said. It was burning chemicals. It was something industrial, something ordinary, something that had absolutely nothing to do with them. When the Americans arrived, every single civilian in that city said the same 4 words. Wir haben nichts gewusst. We knew nothing. They said it with straight faces. As they said it with conviction, some of them said it with indignation, as if the very suggestion that they might have known was an insult to their intelligence and their character. The skinny men they sometimes saw working on the railroad? Volunteers, they said, workers from the east, nothing to worry about. The smoke? A factory, definitely a factory. The smell? Well, yes, sometimes there was an unpleasant smell, but this was wartime, and what could you do? The bubble they lived in was thick and comfortable, and it had taken 8 years to build, and it burst on April 11th, 1945. That was the day the US Third Army arrived. When Patton's tanks came rolling through the region, the SS Guards did what cowards do when the tide turns. They ran, they abandoned the camp, left the prisoners behind, and vanished into the countryside in civilian clothes. The prisoners who were strong enough took control of the gates. They had actually managed to send a secret radio message to the approaching Americans a few days earlier, a message that read, "To the Allied Army, this is K.L. Buchenwald, SOS. We request help. They want to evacuate us. The SS wants to destroy us." The Americans received it. They came faster. When the camp was fully secured and Patton himself walked through those gates a few days later, he thought he was prepared. He had already visited Ohrdruf, a smaller sub-camp, just days before. He had seen things there that no human being should ever have to see. He thought that had hardened him. It hadn't. Nothing could have prepared anyone for Buchenwald. The camp held around 20,000 survivors, and the word survivors barely does them justice, because what Patton saw walking toward him were not really men in any recognizable sense. They were the outline of men, skeletons draped in skin, with eyes sunken so deep into their skulls that they looked like caves, men who weighed 60, sometimes 50 pounds. Children, actual children, who stared up at the American soldiers with expressions that contained no fear, no hope, no joy, because all of those emotions had been starved out of them long ago. Patton was a man who had fought in 2 world wars. He had seen artillery barrages and burning tanks and fields carpeted with the bodies of young soldiers. He was not a soft man. He was the kind of man who once said he loved war, that it was the only thing that made him feel truly alive. But walking through Buchenwald broke something in him. And he wrote in his diary that night, with a hand that witnesses said was visibly shaking, he wrote that he had never felt so sick in his life, that what he had seen was not war, it was madness. He walked to a corner of the courtyard and vomited. Several of his staff officers did the same. A hardened war photographer who had covered the North Africa campaign and the Normandy landings had to put his camera down and walk away. And then Patton looked beyond the fence. He could see the fields outside the camp. He could see German farmers ploughing their land. He could see laundry hanging on lines outside farmhouses. He could see the distant rooftops of Weimar glinting in the spring sunshine, looking peaceful and prosperous, and completely, obscenely normal. Or did the stench from the camp was so powerful that the American soldiers were taking turns vomiting? It was the kind of smell that stayed in your nose for days, that you could taste in your food, that woke you up at 3 in the morning, weeks later. And these people, these farmers, these housewives, these city dwellers, just 5 miles down the road, claimed they couldn't smell it. Patton turned to one of the camp's surviving administrators. He asked a single question. Do the people in that town know about this? The answer came back carefully, diplomatically. They say they don't, General. Patton's face went through several colors. His jaw locked. He slammed his riding crop against his boot hard enough that several nearby officers flinched. He said 3 words. They are lying. And then he called for his provost marshal and he gave an order that had never been given before in the history of modern warfare and has never quite been repeated since. He didn't want the mayor, he didn't want local officials or low-level party members. He wanted the elite. He wanted the people who benefited most from the system, the people whose comfort and status had been propped up by a government committing mass murder 5 miles from their front doors. He wanted the professors, the lawyers, the doctors, the businessmen, the wives of the politicians, the owners of the grand houses on the wide, tree-lined streets. He wanted 1,000 of them, and he wanted them marched up that hill to see what had been done in their name, with their silence, under the cover of their deliberate blindness. The MPs went into Weimar, and they moved through the city with a cold efficiency that must have been alarming to the civilians who watched them. They knocked on the doors of the villas, they walked into the shops and the restaurants and the university buildings. They found the well-dressed, the well-fed, the well-connected, and they delivered the same message to each of them. You are going for a walk, bring your coat. General Patton invites you to visit your neighbors. The reactions were predictable. Some were confused, some were outraged. One man, reportedly a doctor, stood in his doorway and informed the MP knocking on his door that he was a professional, a man of standing, and could not simply be ordered around like a common labourer. The MP raised his rifle. The doctor put on his coat. Others complained about their shoes, about the dust on the road, and about the inconvenience of it all. They were certain this was some kind of propaganda stunt, some heavy-handed American attempt to humiliate them. They were certain that whatever they were being taken to see would be exaggerated, staged, politically motivated. They were wrong about all of it. The column formed on the road outside the city, 1,000 people, all of them well-dressed. Many of the women had taken the time to apply fresh lipstick before leaving their houses, as if this were a social occasion, and appearances still mattered. The mood as they set off up the hill was almost light. They chatted with each other. They complained about the Americans in low voices. Some smiled and waved at the cameras that the US Army photographers were pointing at them, seemingly unaware or unbothered by what those photographs might eventually represent. They thought they were walking to an inconvenience. They treated it like a minor irritation in an otherwise pleasant spring day. The walk took around 2 hours. For most of it, the mood among the civilians held. The complaints continued, the chatter continued. The Americans driving alongside them in jeeps said nothing, just watched. But as the column climbed higher, as the trees thinned and the top of the hill came into view, something began to change. It started with the wind. The wind shifted direction just slightly, and the smell came down the hill toward them like a wave. Not the fresh spring air they had been breathing on the road out of the city. Something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in the world of tailored suits and fur coats and opera houses. Something old and heavy and wrong in a way that the human body recognizes before the brain can even process it. The chatting stopped. First at the front of the column, then spreading back through the crowd like a ripple across a pond. The women stopped fixing their hair. The men stopped murmuring to each other. They pulled out handkerchiefs. They pressed perfumed scarves against their noses. They slowed their pace instinctively, the way any living creature slows when it senses danger ahead. But the soldiers flanking them didn't slow. "Keep moving," they said. "No stopping. Keep moving." They came to the gate. The main gate of Buchenwald was made of iron, black and heavy and permanent. Worked into the metal of the gate, and in the ornate Gothic lettering that the Nazis loved was a phrase. "Jedem das Seine." To each his own. It was a cruel joke, a twisted philosophical statement placed at the entrance to a place where human beings had been systematically worked and starved and beaten and burned. The SS considered themselves witty. The civilians filed through the gate, one by one, and stepped into the camp. What they saw on the other side of that gate stopped them cold. The surviving prisoners were gathered behind the barbed wire fencing, thousands of them standing in complete silence, watching. These were the men and women that the civilians of Weimar had spent 8 years insisting did not exist, or if they did exist, were there voluntarily, or if they weren't there voluntarily, were criminals who deserved it. And now they were standing 10 feet away, staring. Oh, and their faces were beyond gaunt. Their eyes had a quality that survivors, aid workers, and liberating soldiers consistently struggled to describe. Not angry, not sad, not pleading, just utterly, completely empty. As if whatever mechanism produces ordinary human emotion had been methodically dismantled over years of deliberate cruelty. They didn't scream at the civilians, they didn't rush the fence, they just stared. And that silence, that absolute, unbroken silence from thousands of people who had every conceivable reason to scream, was more devastating than any accusation could have been. Several civilians in the column began to cry before they had even taken 10 steps inside the gate. They didn't fully understand yet what they were looking at, but their bodies understood. Something in the most primitive part of the human brain understood. And the American soldiers formed a corridor through the camp, and they moved the civilians through it with a grim, methodical purpose. There was no rushing, no shouting, no drama from the soldiers. They simply directed the column forward from one stop to the next, like guides on the most terrible tour ever conceived. The first stop was the crematorium. In the courtyard outside the crematorium building was a trailer, an ordinary wooden trailer of the kind used for hauling cargo. But the cargo on this trailer was human bodies, dozens of them piled on top of each other, naked, their arms and legs tangled together in the random geometry of the discarded. They were so emaciated that they barely looked real. Their skin was the color and texture of old parchment. Their mouths were open. Their eyes, in many cases, were open too, staring up at the spring sky with an expression that was somehow worse than anguish. It was absence. Pure, total absence. The civilians stopped walking. The color left their faces so completely and so quickly that witnesses described it as watching people age 20 years in 10 seconds. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then a woman near the front of the column, wearing a heavy fur coat that probably cost more than most working families earned in a year, pressed her hand to her mouth. She began to shake. The shaking spread up through her body until her whole frame was convulsing. And then she screamed, a single, raw, broken sound that cut through the silence of the camp like a blade. And then she fainted. She went down hard, collapsing into the dirt and mud of the courtyard, her fur coat spreading around her. An American MP stepped forward. He looked down at her. He did not kneel to help her. He nudged her with his boot. "Get up," he said. "You haven't seen anything yet." That moment and that single exchange between a fainting German woman and an American soldier with a boot and no patience left for pretense might be the precise instant when the myth of the innocent bystander died. Not officially, not in the history books, but in the gut, in the place where you know things before you can argue about them. The soldiers pushed the column forward. If anyone turned their head away from what they were looking at, a hand would reach out and grip their chin and physically turn their face back toward it. "Look," the soldiers said in German, because many of them spoke it. "Look at this, you say you didn't know. And look at this and tell us again that you didn't know." They were taken inside a building. This was the pathology laboratory, which was already a clinical, sterile name for something that had nothing clinical or sterile about it. The SS had kept medical records. They had prided themselves on their documentation, their orderliness, their scientific approach to what they were doing, but they had also kept something else, souvenirs. On a table in that room, laid out with a kind of grotesque neatness, like items in a museum display case, were objects that represented the full depth of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when they convince themselves that the people they are doing it to are not really people at all. There were two shrunken heads of Polish prisoners to reduced and preserved by a process that the SS found amusing. There were pieces of human skin removed from prisoners after death, tanned and treated, used to make lampshades and book covers and small decorative items. The woman responsible for collecting much of this, the wife of the camp commandant, was a woman named Ilse Koch. She would become known to history by the name the prisoners gave her, the bitch of Buchenwald. She had a particular fondness for prisoners with elaborate tattoos. When she saw one she liked, she would have the prisoner killed so that the skin could be preserved for her collection. She had specific preferences in terms of color and design. She had taste in the same way that a monster can have taste. An American officer stood beside the table. He spoke German fluently, and he waited for the civilians to process what they were looking at. He waited for the weeping and the vomiting and the stumbling backward and the hands pressed against mouths to subside slightly. And then he spoke. "You say you didn't know," he said. "These were made here, in your backyard, while you were at the theatre, while you were drinking your morning coffee, while you were reading Goethe and congratulating yourselves on being the most civilized people in Europe." Nobody in the room had an answer for that. The architecture of denial that 1,000 people had spent years constructing brick by careful brick was simply not built to withstand this room. It collapsed. Men in expensive suits were weeping openly, without any apparent concern for what it looked like. Some were bent double in the corner, sick, and others simply stood and stared at the table with expressions that no longer corresponded to any ordinary human emotion. The tour continued. They were taken to what was called the Little Camp, the quarantine section, where prisoners in the final stages of starvation and disease were separated from the main population. Typhus was rampant. The smell here was so overwhelming that even the hardened American soldiers were wearing masks when they worked in this section. The civilians were not given masks. They were required to breathe the air, to let it into their lungs, to understand in a physical, bodily way what it had been like to exist in this place. It was in this section that something happened that no official report could fully capture. A former prisoner, a man so thin that his clothes hung from him like cloth draped over a coat rack, he walked slowly toward the column of civilians. He stopped in front of a man in a banker's suit. He raised one hand and pointed a shaking finger directly at him. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but in the silence it carried clearly. "I remember you," he said. "I worked at the train station. I saw you there. You saw me. You looked at me, and then you looked away." The banker's face crumpled, not gradually. All at once. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. He covered his face with his hands. "I didn't know," he sobbed. "I swear I didn't know." He said it over and over, as if repetition could make it true, as if saying it enough times might retroactively make the looking away acceptable, might erase the moment on the train platform when he had seen a hollow-eyed man in striped clothing and chosen, in the space of half a second, to find something else to look at. Nobody helped the banker up. The column moved on. By the time the tour ended, the 1,000 citizens of Weimar were unrecognizable as the people who had set off from the city that morning. They filed out through the iron gate in complete silence. No chatting, no complaining about dusty shoes. The women's makeup was destroyed, streaked down their faces in long grey lines. The men's suits were dirty, their shoulders bent, their faces slack with something that went beyond shock. They walked back down the hill toward their city of Goethe and Schiller and Bauhaus and culture and civilization. And the hill behind them was different now. It would always be different. They would never be able to look at it again without seeing what was on the other side. When Eisenhower heard what Patton had done, his response was not to reprimand him. His response was to scale it up. Eisenhower was a man who was already thinking beyond the war, already thinking about what came after, about memory and denial and the long arc of history. He understood instinctively what Patton had understood in his gut, that this had to be witnessed, that witnesses had to be made deliberately and systematically before the war was even over, because he already knew that the moment it ended, the forgetting would begin. He sent cables to Washington and to London. He ordered journalists to come. He ordered members of Congress and members of the British Parliament to come. He ordered newspaper editors and photographers and film crews to come. He wanted the record to be so thick, so dense, so overwhelming that it could never be argued away. He said, and in words that have been quoted many times since but bear repeating, that the things he had seen beggared description, and that he had made his visit deliberately so that he would be in a position to give first-hand evidence if ever in the future anyone developed a tendency to dismiss these things as mere propaganda. He knew. Standing in that camp in April 1945, with the war still technically ongoing, Eisenhower already knew that people would try to say it never happened. He was already preparing the counter-argument. He was building the wall of evidence before the deniers had even begun to organize. The consequences of Patton's forced march rippled through Weimar in the days that followed. The shame was not an abstraction for the people who had walked up that hill. It was something they carried home with them and set down in their living rooms and could not get rid of. Several of the prominent citizens who had been on the tour took their own lives in the days after returning. They had spent years constructing an identity built on culture and refinement and moral superiority. They had told themselves that they were good people, educated people, people who listened to Beethoven and therefore could not possibly be complicit in barbarism. And then they had stood in a room with a table full of lampshades made from human skin and had to accept that the Beethoven and the lampshades had existed simultaneously, 5 miles apart, under the same sky, breathing the same air, and they had chosen the Beethoven and called it innocence. Some of them could not survive that knowledge. Its Patton was informed of the suicides. He did not celebrate, but he did not mourn either. He looked at the officer who told him and he said simply, "Good. Maybe the rest of them will learn." Whether they learned is a question that history answers in complicated ways. The city of Weimar rebuilt, Germany rebuilt. The world moved on with the terrifying speed that it always moves on, because the alternative, to stop and fully absorb the weight of what happened, would have made ordinary life impossible for an entire generation. The trials at Nuremberg established the legal framework for what had been done. The evidence was presented, the verdicts were rendered. The world agreed officially, formally, on paper, that this had been the worst crime in modern history. And yet, why the question that Patton's forced march raises is not really a historical question. It's a present tense question. It's a question about what ordinary people know and choose not to know. It's a question about the mechanics of deliberate blindness, about the way that human beings can construct elaborate internal justifications for looking away from things that are happening right in front of them, when looking directly at those things would require them to act, or to speak, or to sacrifice something comfortable. The citizens of Weimar were not stupid people. They were not uneducated people. They were not people who lacked the capacity to understand what was happening on the other side of that hill. They were people who had made a choice, quietly, privately, repeatedly, over 8 years of mornings and evenings and weekends. To decide that the smell was a factory and the ash was industrial and the skinny men on the railroad were volunteers. The choice has a name. It isn't ignorance. Ignorance is passive. What those citizens practiced was something more active, more deliberate, more morally complex. It was a form of agreement, a silent, unspoken, socially enforced agreement among people who all knew, on some level, what they were agreeing not to see. Patton understood that. He wasn't a philosopher, and he wasn't interested in being one. He was a soldier with a riding crop, and a very short temper, and an absolute inability to tolerate the kind of comfortable self-deception he saw on the faces of those Weimar citizens when his MPs brought them out of their villas. He understood that the lie of "we didn't know" was not really a claim about knowledge, and it was a claim about responsibility, and he decided, with the bluntness that defined everything he did, that he was going to make it impossible for those particular people, on that particular day, to continue making that claim. He marched them up the hill. He made them walk through the gate. He made them stand in the room with the table. He made them breathe the air of the little camp without masks. He made them look. And looking, it turned out, was enough. The excuse "we didn't know" has outlived everyone who was on that march up the Ettersberg Hill in April 1945. It gets used in different countries, in different languages, in different contexts, in different centuries. It is one of the most durable and versatile tools in the human moral toolkit. It requires very little effort to deploy, and it offers tremendous protection against the discomfort of accountability. The citizens of Weimar used it. Patton decided it wasn't good enough. He decided that proximity creates responsibility, that you cannot live 5 miles downwind of a crematorium for 8 years and then stand in your fur coat and claim that the smoke was a mystery. The people who walked back down that hill on April 16, 1945, walked back into a world that looked exactly the same as the one they had left that morning. The same streets, the same houses, the same shops, the same city of poets and philosophers. But nothing was the same. The knowledge they carried down from that hill was not the kind of knowledge that could be put away in a drawer and forgotten. It had been installed in them forcibly and permanently, in the pathology lab, in the crematorium courtyard, in the gaze of the living skeletons staring through the barbed wire. They walked up that hill as the elite of Weimar, the educated, the sophisticated, the culturally superior, the innocent. They walked down as something they had no name for yet, something that the history books would eventually try to categorize and debate and contextualize. But in the moment, on that road, in the spring sunshine, walking back toward a city that would never look quite the same again, they were simply people who could no longer pretend. The ghost of Buchenwald had followed them home, and it would not leave. The question Patton forced the people of Weimar to answer in 1945 is still waiting for the rest of us. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.